love working with the NDN. You were formed in 1996 when I first got to Congress, so the Democratic Coalition came into being at the same time, and we've worked together on a good many issues. And through the years, I mean, Simon has always been ahead of the curve in terms of understanding where progressive policy needs to go, and progressive politics as well. Works both ends. The politics oftentimes being the far more challenging piece of it, as a matter of fact, keeping progressive politics moving forward, and Simon has dared to be a leader on that as well, that I think has ultimately been very, very helpful to the progressive movement and to the Democratic Party as well. In addition to that, he's a very good friend. So it's been great working with you. Honored to be here. It's particularly an honor to be sitting next to Peter Bergen. Vaguely intimidating. As members of Congress, we used to know a little bit about a lot. Unfortunately, we can usually count on being in a room with people who are in the same boat. It's intimidating to have someone who actually, has been to Afghanistan and Pakistan many, many times and knows the issues vastly better than I do. But it's also an honor to be up here, and look forward to hearing your remarks, and have read just about everything you've written, because I think you have a great perspective on what's going on over there, and certainly a deep understanding. So I'm going to just hit upon a couple of points, quickly, and then turn it over to Peter and take your questions. I think the first thing is, it is very, very appropriate that the President is doing the review of Afghan policy that he is doing. There are many folks out there who are critical, saying he's, I believe, dithering, in the words of the Vice President, not moving quickly enough. Ex-Vice President, sorry. Yeah, one never knows. Sorry, should have been careful about that. And I think that's just completely wrong, because if there's one thing that I think most sensible people should agree on, it's that over the course of the 8 years that we've been in Afghanistan, we have made a lot of mistakes and done a lot of things that have not been helpful, and significant changes in our approach are needed. And there may be some disagreement on what those changes should be. I think there's pretty widespread agreement that we need to change our policies and move forward in a more positive direction. And it makes sense for the President to take the time to try and get that as right as possible. Just like I think it made a great deal of sense for him to put General McChrystal in charge. Now that General McChrystal has been there for a few months, it again makes sense to evaluate. What has he seen? What has he learned? Where does he think we need to go? Take the time to get it right and move forward with a positive decision, because this is a critical, critical part of the world for our national security. The other things that I think are true as we look at where to go in the direction of that policy is how important this region is to the counterterrorism fight and the fight against al-Qaeda. I was talking with Peter before we came down here. Anyone who starts off by saying, well, al-Qaeda's in 55 different countries, they're not even in Afghanistan, they moved into Pakistan, why is this area any more important than any of those other places where al-Qaeda is? Anyone coming from that perspective, I think, really doesn't understand what's going on. There is a 30-year relationship in this region between the senior leadership of al-Qaeda and the Taliban that is closer than any relationship they have anyplace else in the world. This is the place where they are most likely to find a safe haven where they can plot and plan and build off of those relationships. It is not a place that we can afford to ignore. Nor is it a correct assumption to say, well, if we drove them out of there, they would just go someplace else. They might try. They would have a devil of a time making it work as well someplace else as they've made it work in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. This region needs to be at the absolute top of our list of priorities. One of the things that I most strongly agreed with President Obama, or then candidate Obama, was how central he made Afghanistan and Pakistan to the war on terror. Harry continually said that in Iraq we took our eye off the ball from the place that was most important. I think he was absolutely right about that as a candidate, and I think it's still very, very true today. But the great challenge that we have there, as we're trying to stop the Taliban from regaining power in Afghanistan, is to find a reliable Afghan partner to present as an alternative. Because in sort of a village-by-village, province-by-province struggle here, that's what this is in an interesting sort of way. It's a political campaign. Both sides trying to get the support of the local population so that they can exercise power over them. Now, certainly there are tools used in this particular campaign that are more violent than are used in your typical political campaign here, but it is still about having an entity, a person that we hold out as the representative for these people. And in Afghanistan right now, I think that is the biggest challenge that we face. For whatever the deficiencies of the Taliban, and there are many, and they're recognized by the Afghan people, the Taliban are not popular there. The alternative of the current Afghan government, which seems mostly corrupt, incompetent, and unable to deliver the basic services to the Afghan people in far, far too many places, makes the Taliban look good by comparison. There's political candidates, we always enjoy the fact that at the end of the day, it is a choice between two people. And whatever your deficiencies may be, you can always point to the deficiencies of the alternative and argue that you would be better. That's why people like negative campaigning. It's oftentimes easier to deliver that message. And the Taliban have that advantage there right now. We do not have a reliable partner. And that is our greatest struggle and greatest challenge going forward, to develop that reliable partner. Now, with that said, I think the good news in the situation is precisely because so many things have gone so wrong for so long, it gives us the opportunity to do it better. And building on that, I have an enormous amount of confidence in General McChrystal. He is about as clear-eyed a military leader as I have ever met. He looks at and understands the situation for what it is. He doesn't just show up and say, you know, whatever the mission, we'll get it done. I thought one of the best answers he gave during his 60 Minutes interview was when he was asked, you know, if there would ever come a point when he would go to the president and say, look, we just can't get this done. And he said, absolutely, of course there would come that point. And the second that happens, I'll go to the president and tell him. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that we can do the impossible, because that is not a responsible approach to managing the difficult challenges that we have in Afghanistan. So I believe that he has looked at the mistakes we have made. I'm not going to go through all of them. One big point that I do want to emphasize is on the development side, on basically getting in place a structure that provides for the Afghan people. First of all, when we look at what that ultimately looks like, I think there has been some sort of misplaced criticism on this, that we're engaged in a nation-building exercise, and people imagine that a nation-building exercise requires you to do absolutely everything for Afghanistan, so that eventually it winds up looking like, you know, a modern U.S. city. That's not the standard. They actually have a relatively low standard in Afghanistan for what needs to be done. It's just that we're not even meeting that particularly low standard at the time. And part of the problem there is a lack of coordination with our development strategy. Yes, part of the problem is also something that has been widely noted, that we do not have enough of an Afghan focus. We are not listening enough to the local population and taking their guidance. This has led to things like building schools or drilling wells in the wrong place, in a place that basically, for instance, puts it in between two rival villages, so that then there's a battle over who controls it. So it actually winds up disrupting the local community more than solving it. A lack of understanding of the sort of village-by-village nature of Afghanistan has led us, you know, down the wrong path. But also there's another lack of coordination. And this, you know, flows all the way up to problems with our development policy that we have. We do not have a global development policy. We have about 35 or 40 different agencies that have a piece of it. We don't even have a USAID director as we speak right now. And USAID is a shadow of its former self. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of NGOs that are doing, in many cases, good things in Afghanistan, but nobody is coordinating it. Not to mention the 42 other countries that are involved there. We're all stepping over each other, so that the output from the amount of resources that we're putting in is nowhere near what it should be. Correcting that, getting a coherent policy for the amount of money that we're spending on every aspect of development, you know, from rule of law to, you know, agriculture to basic roads and bridges, that can be done a lot better than it's currently being done. You know, one of the statistics that was told me by a couple of people when I was in Afghanistan was that Greg Mortensen, the 3 Cups of Tea guy, I think most everybody knows who he is. He's been building schools, and mostly in Pakistan, I think some in Afghanistan as well. He can build a school in that region for $29,000. Same school built by the USAID, $600,000. That's a bit of a problem. That is not an efficient use of resources. And we can change all of that and make it better. The rule of law can be brought into these villages in a way that shows them an alternative to the Taliban. Because that very basic thing, you know, forget an elaborate infrastructure or jobs or a strong economy, just a basic dependable rule of law is something else that we have failed at. And the way it was described to me by folks over there was, you know, when the Taliban come in, there's one bribe that you have to pay to one person, and you know once you've paid it, you're good to go. In too many instances in other places, you know, there's 7 different checkpoints along the road one day, there's 8 the next day, you're paying different people, the amount of money's going up, and you're not even getting what you're paying for. You know, keep in mind, Tammany Hall at least delivered services. Yes, they took their cut, but they provided something. Right now in Afghanistan, everyone's taking their cut, and very few people are actually providing anything, even the basic rule of law structure. Taliban come in their own primitive way, impose a structure that people can at least understand and depend on. We have not done that. Now, I'll close by saying, going forward, the big question is, so what do we do? And I think there are a couple of big variables there. I do not think, and few people think, that we can simply pull up stakes and leave. The region is too important. It would be too destabilizing. But what sort of resource commitment do we make going forward? Do we send in 40,000 more troops? Do we increase our military presence? Or do we just try to fix some of those things that I've outlined and many others that General McChrystal and others have identified? And I think the two big variables to weigh in that are, number one, how negative is our presence? And I get a lot of different answers to this. Is part of the insurgency, a significant part of the insurgency, really being fueled by the presence of U.S. troops? It's still a relatively small footprint for a very large country. I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but I think we have somewhere short of 100,000 troops all in, including U.S. as well as the ISAF forces. So most Afghans go through the day and never see any of this presence. Number one. Number two, they don't like the Taliban. Most polls show that they still support the international presence and look for it to help them. On the other hand, certainly there is evidence that the Taliban are using as a recruitment tool the foreign occupying presence. We saw just this week one of their propaganda pieces that some group of U.S. soldiers had supposedly desecrated the Quran. As near as I can tell, it was completely and totally made up out of whole cloth, but it served the desired effect. A foreign occupying force not respecting the local culture and the local customs and the local religion. How much does that drive the insurgency? If we send 40,000 more troops, does that feed into that and move us more in a direction that the insurgency is going to grow? The second variable is how unified the Taliban are and how strong they are. If we don't send 40,000 troops, do they really start to take over significant territory? Other than just a valley here, a valley there, do they move in and take over a major population center? Are they strong enough to do that if we don't come up with a stronger security response? I think where you come down on those two factors has a lot to do with what the relative troop presence should be. But no matter what that is, we've got to get that other stuff right. Too much of this has been brought down to, either you send more troops or you don't. You're in or you're out. I don't think it's that black and white a choice in Afghanistan right now. I think that we do need to look at it and figure out how we're going to do better what we're doing and balance that out. I've not said anything about Pakistan. Obviously, they're critically important to this region as well. There's actually some positive developments there as the Pakistanis are now confronting the Taliban in their part of the world. And they're also working with us more closely. I'll do a quick little shout out to the Special Operations Command that I think has been very, very responsible for improving the relationship. They're over there training the Pakistanis in counterinsurgency tactics. Pakistan armies had some success in SWAT and elsewhere, and they like being successful. And they are mindful of the fact that it is the training that they've received from our SOCOM guys that has a lot to do with that. And also our special operations guys do the training with the requisite amount of cultural sensitivity. Pakistan has a great deal of pride in what they do over there. They don't want Americans showing up and saying, okay, stop screwing up, we're going to fix it. And our SOCOM guys have respected that. They're over there to help and work with them and to respect the local Pakistanis in terms of how they do that. So a very, very important region that we're going to be involved in for some time to come. I believe we're on the path towards improving some of the mistakes we've made, but we've got a long way to go.
Adam, thank you. That was a lot to take in. And, Peter.
Well, that was really a very helpful exposition of some of the choices that we need to be facing, Sarah. And Simon, thank you very much for the invitation. And Caitlin, very nice to see you. I guess I'm going to make some sort of general observations. One, I think there are three center of gravities in the conflict. And the first center of gravity is the American public. And the Taliban understands that the center of gravity for them is the American public. And the American public, if you ask them in 2002, is the war in Afghanistan a mistake? Only 9% said yes. That number today is 57%, and by the end of the year, it might be 75%. As you know, this was the worst month for American military deaths since the war began. Now, in my view, and you can challenge me on this, and I was mentioning this to Simon earlier, Americans are actually quite tolerant for casualties. They don't like them, but they really don't like them when they think they're either not losing, either not winning or even losing. And right now, what happened is Afghanistan became the forgotten war. And when Americans sort of turned their TV screens on again 6 years after basically ignoring it, What they saw was a resurgent Taliban, the world's largest producer of heroin, a corrupt government, and they were like, well, I thought we won this war. And so, there was a sort of sense of shock. And so this is the first center of gravity. Now, the attack today, for instance, on the United Nations by the Taliban is designed to, with American population and Western domestic populations, to affect their calculations. And so these are information, these military operations are information operations in a sense. They think about how this is going to play out in the West. So the first point is we're losing on that particular front. The second front that we're also losing on, we're not losing the Afghan public because, as the congressman correctly pointed out, the Afghan public still wants us there. I mean, just to give you one data point, 63% of Afghans in the most recent poll had a favorable view of the U.S. military. Now, can you think of a country in the world other than the United States that has, I mean, there are places probably on the Upper West Side that don't feel the same way. But, so this is, and these numbers, by the way, are extraordinarily consistent. We've had dozens of polls in Afghanistan, and some people that all have the same. The numbers have drifted down. It might have been 85% in 2005. These are, by the way, countrywide polls conducted by BBC, ABC, NHK, the Japanese network, Asia Society. They are, and some people say we can't trust polling in Afghanistan. Well, the very same organizations also conduct polling in Pakistan, and they consistently find that Pakistan is probably the most anti-American country in the world, and I trust both of those polls. Pakistanis are very anti-American. Afghans remain. We're disappointing them slightly, but they still want us to leave and to stay because they know what the alternative might be. The third center of gravity, very important, and the Congressman raised it, I think, very important point, is Pakistan. Now, let's look past the headlines a little bit. Today's headlines were, obviously truly terrible, Heather Cliff. But they obscure, I think, an incredibly important point. What is the center of gravity in the war on terrorism? Is the Pakistani public. Because the Pakistani public, that's where Al-Qaeda is headquartered. That's where the Taliban are headquartered. Now, if bin Laden's regarded as a Robin Hood figure and the Taliban are regarded as just a great bunch of guys, as Pakistanis certainly thought in the last several years ago, we have a big problem because these groups need some measure of popular support to survive. But if instead they're seen as basically thugs, which is increasingly the view, support for suicide bombing in Pakistan has dropped from 33% to 5% in the last 5 years. Pakistanis ask the question, is religious extremism a problem? 90% of them now say it's a problem. Support for bin Laden is dropping, support for the Taliban. And if you were to design an information operations campaign against the Taliban, there would be no better way than to send a text message to pretty much every Pakistani parent saying, it's too dangerous to send your kids to school today, which is what has happened in the last week. Every Pakistani family's had to take their kids out of school because of the attack on the Islamabad University. So this is a game changer. And so and that has a very major political effects because the war in SWAT, there have been 2 wars in SWAT. There was one in 2007. It was done with zero public support, and it was seen as just doing the bidding of the Americans. In 2009, it was done, there was a lot of popular support for this. And it was done in a very Pakistani way. It wasn't, a classic counterinsurgency. Use of artillery is not usually part of it. But it was still somewhat effective. So, and now going into Waziristan, again, in the past, when they've gone into Waziristan, it was sort of a form of performance art. Basically, and often would take place when senior government officials from the United States were visiting Pakistan. For instance, when they went into Waziristan for the first time was when Secretary Powell visited. So now this Waziristan operation has been going on for months. It's serious, it's large scale, it may not be perfect, but it's something. So those are sort of 3 underlying tectonic shifts that affect this. And in Pakistan, actually, I think there is some really good news. In addition to what I've just mentioned, MMA, which is the religious parties, the pro-Taliban religious parties that controlled the Northwest Frontier and Baluchistan, were annihilated in the elections of 2008. They lost control of these provinces. They got 2% of the vote. Pakistanis really do not want these people in charge. They don't deliver anything. Second point, the lawyers' movement, really an independent of the parties, pro-democratic, obviously, basically got rid of Musharraf. And then third point, all of this exists in a new media environment, very important point. If you went to Pakistan 10 years ago, you turn on the TV, it's just Pakistan TV, it's a bunch of guys shaking hands. Now you have 30 independent channels, all of which are basically pro-democracy, anti-Taliban. One of the Taliban have made there's been no 9/11, but there's been a cumulative 9/11, killing Benazir, the most popular politician in the country. a widely distributed videotape of a 17-year-old girl being flogged that was shown on every TV station, attempting to kill a visiting cricket team, cricket being a form of religion in Pakistan. Again, each one of these things, and then killing thousands of civilians and hundreds of Pakistani police and soldiers. So on the Pakistan side, things are looking pretty good. On the Afghan side, today it doesn't look so great, but I think there are still some pretty positive things. And just sort of in closing, want to just dispel some common myths. You're more likely to be murdered in the United States in 1991 than you are as an Afghan civilian to die in the war today. I mean, the war looks pretty bad. It's on a different order of magnitude than what happened in Iraq. You're 20 times more likely to be killed in Iraq as an Iraqi civilian in January of 2007 than you are in Afghanistan today. You're still 4 times more likely to be killed in Iraq. So Iraq is still, even today, a more violent place. The idea that Afghanistan doesn't want to be a nation is ridiculous. It was the first modern Afghan nation was founded in 1747, older than the United States. They've always had a sense of nationhood. It's always been a weak central state. This will not be Obama's Vietnam, and the analogies is just, I mean, it might be his Afghanistan for all sorts of different reasons. It's not going to be his Iraq. It's not going to be his Vietnam. It's a very, very different kind of conflict. And just to respond to some of the questions that the Congressman raised, how large are the Taliban as a military force? Well, 20,000. So they can't do a Tet-style offensive on Kabul, let alone any other city. They are a major tactical problem. They are not a strategic problem. They haven't taken a single town since this insurgency has been going on. The problem is not that they're so strong. It's the problem is the Afghan army and government are so weak. And so we have to do all the heavy lifting. No one's going to help us. I mean, we can go to our NATO allies and say, you've got to do more, you've got to do more. Believe me, they're going to do nothing more. They're not going to collectively commit political suicide by sending more troops to be killed in what they thought was a peacekeeping operation. So, what should we do is above my pay grade, but I'm pretty confident we should be doing more rather than less. And I thought the most interesting quote Sam and I were talking about in the paper today was, it's going to be McChrystal for the cities and Biden for the countries. That makes a huge amount of sense. I've been embedded multiple times. We don't need to be. On my recent embed in Helmand, we went to this tiny little village outpost. It was, 50 Marines, 6 MRAPs, a whole load of. It took a day. I don't know why we were going there. That must have cost several hundred thousand dollars just to go and visit this really small little village school. We don't have to protect everything. 12% of Afghanistan is cultivatable. Most of it is desert and mountain. We don't need to be in these remote outposts. It puts Americans in harm's way, and it's just simply not necessary. So if it is going to be coin for the cities and CT for the countryside, that is actually and that shows that this deliberative process, and I completely agree with you, has been essential. I mean, the antithesis of this was the non-deliberative process we did in Iraq, where after about 3 or 4 years, we finally worked out what to do. We don't, so. This is, I think, the right. One final point is, I think the number that is going to be authorized is much larger than is perhaps presumed.
I'm sure that we'll be able to talk about that tonight. Thank you both. I have, sitting in this chair, I'm going to ask one first question, and then we'll turn it open to everybody else. Is that, and you gave us, both of you gave us a lot to think about. Is, this whole region, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan. Seems like push down in one place, come up with another. I mean, how do we think about this Afghanistan in the context of Iraq, Pakistan, Iran over time? Because we talked a lot about tonight about Afghanistan, right? But it's playing out in a regional context as well. How do we explain to them? Adam, you have to go home and talk to voters, right, about what's going on. How do you connect the dots with what's happening in Afghanistan and the region? And is this of a concern when you go home? And do people talk about what's going on over there, in general?
Well, I think it certainly is. And there's a number of different pieces. It's not something that you can synthesize down into one general statement. But I would say that I think that the dominant feature in terms of our national security concern is the ideological struggle against Al-Qaeda's ideology. Now, it's not just Al-Qaeda. It's Al-Qaeda and other sort of more violent extremist ideologies. Iran, coming from a completely different place on the perspective, has an ideology equally as threatening. So how do we figure out a way to peacefully coexist the Western world with this part of the world? And I think that is all brought together, and there are layers upon layers of strategy here, and the overwhelming majority of it is non-military. It is about diplomacy. It's about development and relationships, supporting moderate voices in that part of the world. Understanding that's tricky because we are not a trusted messenger in much of that part of the world. So I think sort of a comprehensive strategy to defeat the violent extremist ideologies that have risen up out of those places is sort of the overarching theme, and that is in our national security interest to do it. And as I said, it requires a comprehensive strategy, one that hopefully will be a lot less military in the future. No one speaks more articulately to the downside of military action than General McChrystal. If you, as he said, you kill one enemy, odds are you've just created 20 more. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some people in that part of the world that we need to take out one way or the other. There are. That's why JSOC exists. That's why we have military operation. But it points out that if we're going to truly be successful in the long term, as opposed to just doing the stopgap, we've got to win the broader ideological struggle. We have to find alternatives to that ideology and work with the forces in that part of the world, which are the overwhelming majority of the people who want to defeat it as well. And I think the most encouraging thing is the statistics that Peter cited for where public opinion in that part of the world is going on al-Qaeda, on the Taliban. There's a real opportunity there, but it's part of a comprehensive strategy to deal with that challenge. And then, piece by piece, you can go through all those countries you mentioned, and certainly there are discrete problems in each and discrete challenges for our national security. But I think the overarching theme is to make sure that the violent extremist ideology that al-Qaeda, more than anyone, has given birth to is contained and eventually eliminated.
Well, picking up on that idea, I mean, the good thing is that is not only happening in Pakistan. I mean, what is happening in Pakistan reminds me a lot of what happened in Saudi Arabia in 2003. If you go back to around 9/11, Prince Nayef, the older Prince Nayef, repeatedly said publicly that 9/11 was a Zionist plot. And in case anybody didn't get it the first time, he repeated it publicly. And so that was the Saudi government official view. He's effectively the number 2 official in the kingdom. Now, when al-Qaeda started attacking in Riyadh in May of 2003, and then first of all killed a lot of Westerners and then killed a lot of Saudis, support for al-Qaeda, bin Laden just cratered in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi government took a pretty aggressive, total 180. So some of that is happening in Pakistan, but that's happening country after country. Killing people attending a wedding in Jordan, that did men in Jordan. Zarqa, which is the town that Zarqawi comes from, condemned it by name. Same thing happened in Indonesia. These groups are basically, Jemaah Islamiyah, the al-Qaeda affiliate, is basically out of business. It's killed so many Indonesians. So, I think if it's about the war of ideas, they're losing the war of ideas, and they're not only losing it on a public level, even within the jihadist movement, there are people who are criticizing them on various grounds. We just brought somebody to the United States, a guy called Noman Ben Othman, who ran the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and it's the first, and thanks to Caitlin's help, in fact, who helped me kind of try and negotiate how to get into the country. Luckily, he was able to get in, but he is leading an effort to. This is the first al-Qaeda affiliate that is de-affiliated officially from al-Qaeda, and this is really, that gives me a lot of hope. So even with all the bad news, the long-term trends that are going against these guys are very, very strong.
Great. Let me open it up. Thank you both. Let me open it up to the room. And Jake has got the trusty mic, so please speak into the mic, identify yourself, and ask away. Who'd like to go first? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'd like to, my name is Beth Mendelson with Voice of America, and I wanted to address this to Congressman Smith. Big headline in the New York Times today about Wally Karzai and his being paid by the CIA for 8 years. And interesting that Senator Kerry's office issues a statement today saying that, quote, we should not condemn Ahmed Wali Karzai or damage our critical relations with his brother, President Karzai, on the basis of newspaper articles or rumors, but the appropriate congressional committees must be immediately provided with the most comprehensive and untainted information about his alleged entanglements. That's awfully interesting coming out a week before a runoff and his visiting with President Karzai. Your take on this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think Senator Kerry's right. I mean, we got to figure out the facts before we comment publicly on it. I would just say that in general, our approach in Afghanistan in terms of who the leadership is, whether you're talking about President Karzai or a provincial leader right down to the village level, should be that is for the Afghan people to decide. And we will work with whoever they decide on and respect their local leadership. We have, going back decades, a very, very poor history of picking leaders for these different parts of the world. And I would hope that we would have learned the lesson that, if we want a positive relationship, let's respect the locals enough to let them pick their leaders and not try to game the system. So, whether this has happened or not, it certainly shouldn't. And I think that should be part of our message, is that we're here to support the leadership that you elect, not to try and guide and steer it in any way in terms of deciding who that leadership is going to be. And that's the statement that I would make. Now, we should investigate it, as Senator Kerry said, and determine the truth of it and deal with it when it comes out. But it would be premature to comment on it, on the veracity of it and the implications of it before we get answers to that specific question.
Peter, do you have anything?
I would just say, the three guys who wrote that story, Dexter Filkins, Mark Mazzetti, and Jim Risen, are probably three of the best reporters in the country. I don't think they got it wrong.
Yeah, and I'm not calling into question that. I'm just reserving judgment. That's all, because I have to.
There is no smoking gun. He talked about Wally Karzai's, I guess, alleged drug involvement, and he made that. But I just found it interesting.
Right.
Thank you.
Go ahead, and then we'll come over to Bob.
This is Samim, also from the Voice of America. If I understood correctly, Mr. Adam Smith, Congressman, you said that one of the reasons the Taliban have an advantage in Afghanistan today is that because of weak and corrupted government in Afghanistan. What would be U.S. relationship? How should the United States deal or work with the next Afghan government if the main cause of the problem in Afghanistan today is corrupt leaders and corrupt government?
It is extraordinarily difficult, is the most honest answer that I can give to that. I think it was a very positive step that the runoff election is going to happen. Now, the runoff election could still be as bad as the original election, so we shouldn't go celebrating. But when I was there, it was interesting. A lot of this stuff had just broke. It was right after Labor Day. And the gist of it from the U.S. delegation at that point was, look, let's just get this thing certified. It wasn't perfect, but a runoff would be a disaster. But the more I just sort of moved around the country, I got the sense that people were not at all satisfied with the way that election had been carried out and did not view it as legitimate, which would only further undermine it. So having the runoff gives you at least a chance to have a somewhat legitimate government. And then going forward, I think, a lot of it is sort of step by step and being, a lot more aggressive in our help in trying to point out where the corruption is and urge that government to remove it. I think the biggest step also is to take a local approach. Afghanistan has, in fact, I think Peter's absolutely right, they have a clear sense as a country, but they've always been a very local, I guess the federalism that Ronald Reagan contemplated is very, very real in Afghanistan. They are Afghanistan, but the central government does not, they don't want the central government to control them. It's a village-by-village situation. And I think we need to work on a more local basis. And I think from what I understand, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm diving into deep territory, the Constitution that was created shortly after the Taliban were tossed out of power centralized power to a degree that is somewhat problematic, including the fact, of course, that the president gets to appoint the provincial leaders. Anything that we can do to decentralize power and take it down to the village and provincial level, I think is going to be an absolutely critical and necessary step to deal with this problem.
A question from our online audience. I still love doing this.
It's like, where's that?
I know. We had an event recently where we had 90 people in this room and over 1,000 people watching online, which was really kind of a neat thing. So this is from Dave in Arlington, Virginia. If the U.S. took its eye off the ball in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the AfPak region is the main strategic interest, why not 40,000 additional U.S. troops? Why not more? Why is it so hard to properly resource a population protection coin strategy? Isn't McChrystal's advice credible?
All right. First of all, let me just say that the word AFPAC should be banned from all comments. And I say that with a great deal of seriousness, that we have to respect the region. We cannot lump two proud countries together like we're, doing some sort of empire building. It is Afghanistan and Pakistan. It takes an extra probably half second to say it out completely, and I think we need to do that. Just the serious point for anyone, it's okay for a guy on the web to do that, but policymakers clearly should not. I think, and one of the points that I didn't make in my initial remarks that I think is very important is whatever the mission is, we need to resource it. And I assure you that General McChrystal did not pull the 40,000 number out of his ear. He had a very, very complicated plan in place, and he felt that 40,000 troops were what was necessary to resource it. Now, combine that with the point that Peter made that is spot on correct. We don't need to do a coin strategy in all of Afghanistan, which is a good thing because we couldn't.
Right.
Nobody could. Nobody ever would be able to go into every valley and every village and every corner of that country and implement a full-scale coin strategy would be utterly and completely impossible for a lot of different reasons. What we need to figure out is what regions of the country do we need to be most involved in, and whatever regions those are, we then need to resource that mission. And I haven't really drilled down to figure out exactly what the answer to that question is within McChrystal's recommendation, but I'm sure it's there. And then the other question we do have to ask ourselves, I represent Fort Lewis, which has borne the brunt of the casualties over the course of the last month. I've sent more notes to family in the last month than I have, since the Iraq surge. And there is a very, very real cost to our U.S. troops, to their families. And I think we have to look at this and say, what is the mission? And we have got to assure the American public and the U.S. military that we have a clear sense of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where we're doing it. And if we can't, that we shouldn't just send a whole bunch more troops out there and hope that works out. Now, again, I have a lot of optimism that General McChrystal and the President and those advising him will make that decision and make it correctly. But I guess the point is, if we don't send 40,000, I would hope, and I'm confident that it will be because we've decided we're going to limit the mission further. We're not going to do coin in this area, we're not going to do there. We're going to limit it to these tighter areas, and therefore these are the resources that we need to perform that mission. The number of troops has to match the mission is the bottom line answer.
Peter?
I mean, just to add to that, I think the one thing we're not doing, forget about connecting the Afghan people to the government, we're just not providing security. And, as Hobbes pointed out, in the shadow of the English Civil War, that's the first public good. I mean, this is not a new idea. Everything else is details. And the one thing the Taliban did provide was security. It came at a tremendous cost, a theocratic regime, very brutal, very incompetent, and a pariah on the world stage. We're not even doing what the Taliban did, when they were in power. And that is something we need to get back to. And just to give you one very concrete example, the most important road in the country is the Kabul to Kandahar road, politically and economically. 4 years ago, you could, as I did, just get into a taxi cab in Kandahar Bazaar and just drive up the road. And now if you did that, you'd be committing suicide, not just because you're a Westerner, even an Afghan would be committing suicide. So if we can't secure the most important road in the country, what are we doing? And to me, it's very analogous to Route Irish, which was the road between Baghdad Airport and Baghdad City. I mean, this was the most dangerous road in the world. And it said everything you needed to know about what was really going on in Iraq. And until that turned around, you need to just sort of pick your targets and think about what are the most important things to secure first. And then the ink spot strategy sort of works. And so if you look at the story in today's Post, it was the 10 most important cities, the Ring Road, which is the Kabul to Kandahar road, and the Helmand Valley, because that's where most people live, and that's where and the road is, there's only one really important road in the country.
Okay. Nelson, or Bob? Here, Bob, go ahead.
Peter and Adam, I have two takeaways here. Peter, you said no one is going to stand with us. And Adam, you said we don't have a partner there. We had Karzai, the well-groomed, well-tailored, well-spoken, Americanized Afghan. Who's our partner? And if we don't have
Well, I didn't mean no one's going to stand with us. No one's going to stand. The support we have is the ceiling of what it's ever going to be. And not to trivialize the support, I mean, we talked about a coalition in Iraq. It was basically the British. Now in Afghanistan, there are 42 countries, including, by the way, Muslim countries. Qatar and Jordan have small contingents. So there is a real coalition. But, the Canadians are going to leave in 2011, and the Dutch are going to leave in 2010. The British are, it's very unpopular domestically in these countries. So, we're not going to get additional support except perhaps financial development, these kinds of things. But we're not going to get soldiers' boots on the ground.
As far as local partner is concerned, I think I'd put it slightly differently and say that we need to develop a local partner, that we do not have a reliable one right now. But I believe very strongly that General McChrystal has looked at the situation and believes that we can develop one. If he didn't believe that, he would say that this was not worth doing and we have to have a radically different strategy. And also, again, I'll go back to the point I made earlier, I believe that begins with taking it village by village and looking for the partners locally, not relying on Kabul to deliver it throughout the countryside. And by the way, something that's worth pointing out, and Peter knows more about this than I do as he spent more time there, Kabul, relatively speaking, I've been there about a year apart 3 straight times, is a lot better off than it was a couple years ago. The streets are cleaner, there's more roads, electricity as I understand it. They told me anyway that it was 24/7 mostly within the city itself. So we are making progress in some places, just not in enough. And I think the key to doing that is a decentralized approach. But I'll tell you, if 6 months from now, after implementing some of these changes, we're still in the same boat, we will have to seriously re-examine our ability, what areas we can do a realistic coin strategy in. Because coin always works. I mean, it only works. Sorry, it's buy through and with. It's all about the local population. You have to have them on your side. One final note on that, though, are the positive, and reliable polling numbers that are mentioned. We have a population that does, in fact, support our presence there. They just wish it was more effective. And that's something I think we can work with.
And just to add to that, the worst thing you can do is go into an area and then leave, because then you've put everybody in a very difficult situation. So when I was just recently in Helmand, the most telling comment was a village elder was asked by the Marine Lieutenant Colonel, are you happy that we're here? He said basically, look, you guys are strong, the Taliban are strong, I'm just I'm just sitting here. I don't really have a view on this. It's just like, if you're going to stay, but otherwise the Taliban will come back. And so, if we secure areas, we've got to hold them.
Adam, what's going to happen with the politics in Congress?
Well, the interesting thing about that, the politics are tough. The numbers that Peter cited in terms of where the public is at, I think are very real. I think the public is restless, and that was, it was a great way of putting it. I never thought of it that way before, that they'd, looked away for 4 or 5 years and then came back and went like, what the hell? This is a lot worse than the last time we looked at it, and it's jarring.
Yeah.
It is jarring to look at the casualty numbers and how they've gone up and the impact that that's had. And I think as a consequence, the public is very concerned. And then, of course, you have the internal, politics within our party, the party that's in charge, which is, in general, very concerned about the militancy of our response to 9/11, I think is a fair summary, that we've relied too much on the military in our response to 9/11. Now, that runs the gamut within Democrats. Some, are very extreme in that view in terms of what we should have done. Others are just sort of saying, look, we've relied too much on the military for, a job that has many, many other tools, as we talked about earlier. But that combines to put a massive amount of pressure, on the Democratic Party. I mean, you know our base better than just about anybody. And, they have 3 big issues right now. They want health care. They're very concerned about,
They want the public option.
That's true. And it's almost a quick flip call, which one's more important. It's like, as I said, I get 2 messages from them. You have to vote for health care, whatever it is, but don't you dare vote for it if it doesn't have a public option. Fortunately, I'm a strong supporter of public options, so I don't have a problem in that area. There are other parts of the bill that I do have concerns with, but we're not here to discuss that. But they want that. They want meaningful financial service reform, which, by the way, they're absolutely right about. We can't hold back on that. And they want some evidence overall that we are taking a less military-focused approach to the ideological struggle that we talked about earlier. Does that mean that we pull completely out of Afghanistan? No, but it does mean that if we're out there, putting more troops in, they're going to be very concerned about it, particularly if the Iraq drawdown doesn't happen as quickly as some would like. All of that combines to put a massive amount of political pressure on us. Now, the president's doing it right. He's taking his time so that he can, have a more defensible argument when he puts it out. And I would figure that the Democratic Congress will support this president and what he decides in terms of going forward with Afghan policy. Not a slam dunk, though. And then the question is, where does the vote come? Because that's the other thing is, he can implement this policy. Boom, it goes. What do we get to vote on? Is it in the defense appropriations bill? When do you have that moment where we get to vote going forward or not going forward? It's not always easy. And the last political factor, of course, is the Republicans, many of whom are being very responsible and very consistent. Many others aren't. Many others, after President Bush under-resourced Afghanistan for 8 years, have all of a sudden decided that we have to pull completely out of Afghanistan because Obama's taking a couple of weeks to figure out what the strategy ought to be. They will look for their opportunities, some of them will, to undermine us politically as well. And when you've got an antsy Democratic Party combining with an opportunistic Republican Party, if there is a showdown vote in the House and Senate on whether or not we're going to support this policy, it could be extremely close which way it goes. Now, of course, as has happened before, you can have that showdown vote, and the president can go ahead and do what he wants to do anyway, depending on how they find the funds and how they make that work. But it's going to be difficult.
So part of what you're saying is that if, in the way this gets rolled out, for example, if there's a new AID director that gets rolled out at the same time, that there's that Secretary Clinton's in the region now, as we all know, right? That there are more voices talking about this from a traditional sort of State Department diplomatic point of view to sort of create a chorus as opposed to just a single military voice like McChrystal being new Petraeus, right? That there's a broader sort of argument, language, strategy that's evident and visible and not just a promise, right? Meaning that we need an AID director, there's other things that can be done. That would help inside the politics of the Democrats, you think, in the broader party?
Absolutely, it would help. And then you get the other argument. To the extent that the Democrats are in favor of all of what you've just said, as Peter pointed out, it starts with security. You're not going to send a bunch of USAID people in there to be gunned down and blown up by the Taliban because they don't have any protection. And if we want that, if we're committed to, doing the development of the rule of law, to building roads and drilling wells and building schools and helping the Afghan people develop after 30 years of war, we have to be at least a little bit committed to providing the security necessary for those people to be able to do that. Now, what's the number? Is it 40,000 more? What's the magic number? Well, what are we trying to do? I don't know. But you can't simply say that, the military is the problem. Let's just downsize the military and do everything else. Because that's, if you can't provide security, you can't provide any of those other things either.
Yeah, a comment on that. In Helmand, where I was recently embedded, there were 11,000 Marines, my guess, maybe 3 or 4 U.S. government officials in a place the size of West Virginia. There's one USAID rep. And the reason that there are so few civilians is, as the Congressman indicated, is a security problem. And, we talk about a civilian surge, but look at the numbers. There are, maybe several hundred by new, and of course, one civilian is, a huge force multiplier compared to, let's say, soldiers providing security. But, there is not a ton of people willing to go to Afghanistan right now, it seems. And then the question is, you want to send the right people as well. There may be people who are willing, but are they really agricultural experts in a country where the whole economy is basically agricultural? So I want to endorse what the Congressman said. It's very easy to say, it should be more of a civilian thing, but in practice, who are those people? What are they going to do? Can you provide the security?
Let me take Nelson. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question. Nelson Cunningham with Clardy Associates. I'd like to ask a question about the process that we're watching unfold right now, very publicly here, of the administration making up its mind on what to do next. Shortly after President Obama took office, he increase the number of troops in Afghanistan by 20,000 troops. And that decision happened almost without notice. So the decision was made, people nodded, and we moved on. Why is this second decision on Crystal's request for additional troops, why is it being played out so publicly? Why is this such a wrenching decision? And maybe I could also throw in there, because it has been such a public process, what do we make of the way that General McChrystal has perhaps made this a public process? And is that the right way for these decisions to be made?
On the first point, I mean, to the Bush administration's credit, this 20,000 was a Bush administration idea, not an Obama administration idea, point one. Point two, because General Lute, who's in charge of the NSC for the Afghan and Iraq policy, he's a holdover from the Bush administration. So it's their policy. This was something they inherited. Second point, that number was very driven by the election. You had to get people into the country to secure the election. Now, this process is not so driven by a particular moment in time that you've got to get people in. And personally, I think it's appropriate. And McChrystal didn't leak his own assessment. That was, we don't know where it was leaked. So, the only thing that you can really perhaps criticize him on is his statement in London at the IISS, but clearly he feels very strongly that a CT mission, just to do a CT mission doesn't make sense. The reason that has so much validity is he ran a CT mission in Iraq. He killed Zakawi. So he knows that is not sufficient. When Zakawi was killed, the violence in Iraq actually went up for about a year. So taking out doing CT doesn't make it's nonsensical. So even if he may have overstepped the bounds a little bit over there, he was certainly correct.
And I concur completely. The first decision was short-term, immediate. Now we really, and I think it's true, both the public and the policymakers feel like we're making a decision that's going to lock us in for a couple of years. This is the decision about where we're going for at least the next year, probably at least the next two, because even if you change your mind 6 months from now, it takes a while to unwind it. This is a decision that's going to lock us in for a long period of time. So that's why I think it's more important. Second thing, the reason it's more public's paying a lot more attention to it. This has become a significant issue, and I think it's very appropriate that it should be public. I don't really have a problem, with General McChrystal, publicly, saying, here's what I think should happen, here's my assessment. The public has to be part of this discussion. And the speech in London was actually fairly balanced. He was explaining, here's what's going on, and here's where I think we need to go. So I think the public nature of this has been appropriate. It's going to be public one way or the other. May as well have it out there, let everyone see the decision-making process.
So, gentlemen, we are competing with another urgent national priority, which is the World Series.
You're a Mets fan.
Yeah, I know. And I just want to say, as a good Mets fan, I'm rooting very hard against the Phillies I know, we'll talk about that later. I'm actually rooting for the Yankees for the first time in my life this week, but I know my son, I'm a Mets fan.
As am I.
Yeah. And so let's just, I'd love to hear final thoughts. First of all, thank you both very much. And I've learned a lot tonight, and I hope everybody here has and who's watching online. And I'd love to have both of you back, obviously, to report in during the course of this process. But before we go, and there's some food and wine and other drinks here tonight, we can break in a minute, but just maybe some final thoughts for everybody here before we go. I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. I think the final thought was really, what I just expressed in answer to Nelson's question, is that I think we really should have a lot of respect for this process. That the process is more legitimate, and it is a better answer. I think also contained in what General McChrystal was saying was the understanding that, this is just my opinion, okay? I work for somebody else. And I think, that's what was a little bit different than during the Bush administration. Well, if the generals say it, you got to do it. And if you don't do it, then you're not, supporting the troops. And I think it is an incredible breath of fresh air that we have, finally flushed that misguided notion. There is a reason we have civilian control of the military. It's because ultimately the civilians are responsible for the decisions. We ask the generals for their advice, but the President, members of Congress, Secretary of Defense, we're the ones who are ultimately responsible for deciding what happens. And I think that's the way it should be. Generals have their perspectives, and they're valuable. They are not the only perspectives on how to fight a mission. So I think it is very appropriate that we're doing that. And then ultimately, I think that the most important point is to recognize the importance of this region. And as much, I guess let me say this, as much as we wish there was an easier way, let's make sure that that easier way makes sense and does in fact give the support to the people who are asking to carry out whatever the mission is, give them the support to do it. If we can do it with 40,000 fewer troops instead of 40,000 more, no one's going to be happier than me. Well, that's not true, actually. The 80,000 troops involved are going to be happier than me, as are their families. But let's make sure that the mission matches the resources. And if we're not prepared to provide the resources, downgrade the mission and come up with something that's reasonable. Make sure those two match. And I think that's where this public discussion is going right now, as well as the private discussion. I think it's great, and I look forward to what the administration has to say in terms of laying out that course in the next couple of weeks. And I want to thank Simon again. You always pull together great forums.
Yeah.
Very, very informative and helpful as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to sort of inject a little note of optimism, which is that a very common polling question is, what's your view of the future? And at the end of the second Bush term, 17% of Americans had a favorable view of the future. And when Afghans were polled at the same time, 40% had a favorable view. Now, we all know what went wrong in the country, one of the most corrupt countries in the world, 93% of the world's heroin. But they still have a positive view of the future. And why is that? Well, if you've think about what they've lived through. They've had a totalitarian invasion and a total war by the Soviets, which killed 1 million plus. They then had a civil war and warlords. And then they had the Taliban. I mean, no other country in history has suffered through these three forms of rule or misrule. And so their expectations, as the Congressman said, are pretty low. I mean, they're not looking for the country to be turned into Belgium. They're just looking for us to provide a modicum of security and a modicum of prosperity. And one of the questions I was asked by Simon at the beginning was to provide a model of what a successful Afghanistan might look like. And there's a very good model. It's 1970s Afghanistan. It's a tourist destination, a country at peace with its neighbors, at peace with itself. Relatively pleasant place to live, relatively liberal. I mean, Pakistani upper-class women would go to Kabul on vacation to kind of get away from the strictures of Pakistan. And women would have jobs and were not in the countryside, but so it's not dreamer vision. There is a sort of model of a successful Afghanistan that actually existed, and that is what I hope we eventually get to.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.